And welcome to Inside India. I'm JP Ong, and here are your headlines. U.S.-India trade talks seem to be gaining momentum as President Trump and Prime Minister Modi speak by phone, and as a U.S. trade delegation held positive talks in New Delhi. We'll be speaking with India's former ambassador to the United States just ahead. Plus, we'll also hear from the textile industry, one of the hardest hit sectors from these tariffs. And Indian markets look set to extend gains, with the Nifty trading at 2-month highs amid that trade optimism and ahead of the Fed decision later on today. Good morning, happy Wednesday, and let's take a look at the Asian markets again before they open out in Mumbai later on. And we are seeing it looking a bit mixed, with the sentiment seemingly defense. A lot of markets just holding their breath, perhaps, ahead of the Federal Reserve's very important decision where many are expecting them to actually trim policy rates. Incidentally, we're seeing tech shares in Japan actually performing quite well and perhaps keeping the Nikkei 225 more than just afloat. They're up by about 0.1%. And also the Hang Seng Tech Index keeping and bolstering the broader Hang Seng Index out in Hong Kong. Curiously, it's not doing the same, though, for other tech-influenced sector indices like the South Korean Kospi and the Taiwanese TAIEX, and we're seeing the Shanghai Composite flat to the downside so far in the early hours of trading in mainland China. Markets across Asia will be watching closely for that Federal Reserve policy decision, which is due Wednesday afternoon U.S. time. Expectations are almost unanimous that the central bank will cut rates by 25 basis points, but investors will be focused on the Fed's dot plot and updated economic projections, and looking for clues on the path of monetary policy through the rest of the year. The Indian market's also set to come online in about 45 minutes, and as usual, we're going to take a look at what GIFT Nifty futures are indicating and forecasting or foreshadowing today. Look at that, another day of gains, it seems, for the Nifty futures after it did go up by about 0.7% last Tuesday. 25,394 is where it sits. That is more than 100 points above the Tuesday close. The Indian rupee, though, saw significant strength yesterday, and it seems to be giving that back a bit, unflexing just a tad to about 87 against the U.S. dollar. In trade news, President Donald Trump reiterating overnight that the U.S. and China have a deal on TikTok, but didn't provide any further details. Trump signed an executive order overnight extending the divest or ban deadline for TikTok until December 16. This is to give both sides time to iron out the details. The agreement reached in Madrid is expected to be confirmed after a scheduled phone call on Friday between Presidents Trump and Xi.
Well, we have a deal on TikTok. I've reached a deal with China. I'm going to speak to President Xi on Friday to confirm everything up. We made a very good trade deal, and I hope good for both countries, but a very different deal than they've made in the past.
What companies are going to buy
We'll be announcing that. We have a group of very big companies that want to buy it. And, you know, the kids wanted it so badly. I had parents calling me up. They don't want it for themselves. They want it for their kids. They say, if I don't get it done, they're in big trouble with their kids. And I think it's great. I hate to see value like that thrown out the window.
So auto executives.
You know, you're talking about tens of billions of dollars.
China has called the framework deal to shift TikTok's U.S. operations into American-controlled ownership a win-win, while saying it will review the app's technology exports and intellectual property licensing. Progress on TikTok is seen as paving the way for broader talks as the two countries navigate their tariff truce. Here's what U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent told CNBC.
We need to meet again before November 10th. That is the date that our role expires on the full reciprocal tariffs on China. So we'll be seeing each other again. You know, it's November. It must be Frankfurt, and but each one of those talks has become more and more productive. I think the Chinese now sense that a trade deal is possible.
And after weeks of friction, India and the United States say trade talks in New Delhi were positive and forward-looking. U.S. Trade Envoy Brendan Lynch met Indian officials in New Delhi, with both sides agreeing to step up efforts towards a trade deal. The talks coincided with a phone call between President Trump and Prime Minister Modi, who turns 75 today. Both leaders struck a warm tone, with Trump thanking Modi for his support on ending the Ukraine war, though neither gave details. CNBC TV 18's Parikshit Luthra has more details on those negotiations.
These were the first in-person talks between Brendan Lynch, the chief negotiator from the U.S. Trade Representative's Office, and Special Secretary in India's Commerce Ministry, Rajesh Agarwal, since the 17th of July, when the fifth round of trade negotiations were concluded. There have been virtual rounds of discussion in the last few weeks, but things had taken a really tense turn ever since the U.S. imposed a 25% additional penalty tariff on the 6th of August. Some very sharp rhetoric coming in from U.S. leaders, which had strained India-U.S. relations. But things have started healing over the last 2 weeks, with some very positive messaging and signaling from both sides, especially by President Trump and Prime Minister Modi, which has put the negotiations on a positive track. Having said that, the negotiators met for about 6 hours in the Commerce Ministry in Delhi, which is known as the Vanijya Bhavan. Both sides have described the negotiations as positive. The Indian Commerce Ministry saying that the discussions were forward-looking, covering various aspects of the trade deal, and both sides will now intensify efforts to achieve an early conclusion of a mutually beneficial trade agreement. The U.S. Embassy also calling the talks positive and saying that both sides discussed the next steps in the trade negotiations. We're told that the discussions will now continue in the virtual mode, and effort would be to try and find common ground in the next few weeks.
Well, Arun Kumar Singh is the former Indian ambassador to the United States, Israel, and France, and he joins us today to help us make sense and see just how significant those recent talks between the U.S. and India in New Delhi were actually. Mr. Singh, thank you so much for joining us today. You heard there from Parikshit Luthra a while ago stating that talks seemed to have been positive. That's something the chief negotiator, Rajesh Agarwal, also said, positive and forward-looking. But again, these talks weren't negotiations per se, but just a way to see if they can lay groundwork for actual formal negotiations. Sir, how much do you think was really achieved at these talks?
The talks were important because the process of discussions on the multi-sectoral bilateral free trade agreement had been disrupted towards the end of August. That was when a team was expected to come to India from the office of the U.S. Trade Representative. And because at that time, U.S. had first imposed 25% tariff on India citing trade issues, and another 25% citing India's purchase of oil and energy from Russia, which India had said was unjustified, then that visit had been postponed. So formal discussions related to working out a trade agreement had come to a halt. To that extent, I think this discussion is very, very important. That process has been resumed. Because you recall that when the Indian Prime Minister had visited US in February, in the joint statement that they had said that they would work towards a multi-sectoral bilateral free trade agreement before the end of the year. And India was the first country with which US had launched that process. And coinciding with this, as you pointed out, the US President spoke to the Indian Prime Minister, wished him on his birthday, and then both have come out with very positive messages about where they want to take the relationship. Because I think despite some of the differences that have been there over the past month or so, both realize that working together works for US, it works for India. So there is that convergence. So they're trying to sort of resume the process of consolidating the partnership.
Now, on one hand, it is heartwarming to see President Trump wishing Prime Minister Modi a happy birthday on X, and also indicating the ties and perhaps interest to achieve this trade deal are important. But then you also have what some say is mixed messaging, because on the other hand, you've got the likes of Peter Navarro and Howard Lutnick really trying to put a strong force or press on India, even calling India the Maharaja of tariffs, which some have said is a bit misleading and inaccurate, actually. How do you view this mixed messaging right now? And is this really just part of negotiating with the United States, based on your experience as a former ambassador to that country, sir?
No, it's absolutely. I think it's just part of negotiating with the United States, and the mixed messaging is part of their effort on occasion to create narratives. And at that time, some of the messaging that was coming out also from President Trump had not been very positive. And although the mixed messaging was coming, you could see that both governments were simultaneously making an effort to keep the relationship stabilized. For example, the 2+2 meeting of foreign and defense ministries of the two countries at the mid-official level, that had continued. And the US has a 2+2 process with very few countries, and India similarly has with very few countries. Similarly, the intersessional defense policy dialogue, that had continued. All the functional level meetings of the Quad, which involves US, India, Japan, and Australia, they had continued. A major army exercise between India and the United States was held in Alaska at the same time. So there was an effort from both sides that keep the relationship stabilized, keep the various areas of cooperation going, even as some of the differences are being worked upon. And I think that's based on the fact that for India, certainly India, US is an important partner. It's the largest trading partner, largest investment partner. At 5.4 million, the largest single country presence of Indian origin diaspora. But for the US also, India remains an important partner. And you referred, for example, to the possibility of some kind of a trade agreement being worked out between US and China. The US president likely to talk to President Xi on Friday. They could have a meeting in a couple of months or even earlier. But despite that, US still believes that their main economic, technological and military rival is China. And China is the only country with the intent and capability to replace the US in the international system. So as they deal with the technological competition with China, they believe that India's tech industry, India's digital industry will remain an important partner for the US to maintain its global leadership in innovation. Just as one example, today there are 1,800 global capability centers in India, doing cutting-edge R&D and technology development work, among other support for the global operations of multinational companies. 50% of global capability centers worldwide are based in India. 60% of those based in India belong to US multinational companies, and they are enabling them to maintain their global lead in various areas. So I think given that both countries recognize that there is a convergence of interest in keeping the relationship stabilized and consolidated, and I think that's why the US is now walking back from some of the provocative language that was coming from there. Because if you saw the Indian response, the effort was to be restrained, not to provoke, not to escalate, but remain firm on what are your red lines. And I think eventually the US has started turning around.
Right. Ambassador Singh, you mentioned the Quad earlier on with regards to, as a way to highlight the importance or the important U.S.-India interrelations, actually. Do you think that the meeting in India is going to go through? Because there were expectations that President Trump would visit India for that Quad. Do you think this is back firmly in place?
We'll have to see, because it was too early to schedule summit-level meetings. It could happen next year, but that doesn't matter. But I think the Quad process is very much continuing. So that's the thing to note. And as the positive messaging creeps back in the relationship, I'm sure they will be exploring the possibility of scheduling at some time a Quad leader-level summit. Because again, you have to recall that the Quad process, which had been started in 2004, when India, Japan, US, and Australia had responded to the tsunami in Indonesia at that time, had stalled after 2007. And it was in the first Trump administration in 2017-18 that the Quad process had been reactivated. So Trump himself and his administration have been very invested in the Quad process. So we have to see how they schedule the summit level meeting.
Yeah, you mentioned a while ago that the U.S. and India are aware now, or at least even more aware now, of how important maintaining those ties are, keeping it from eroding, actually. And again, this points to geopolitics and domestic politics. One of your peers, former Ambassador Mohan Kumar, spoke to us the other day and said that the trade talks are not driven by economics now, but more by geopolitics and also domestic politics. Do you think this is indicative of that it's not so much about trade and economics and tariff measures, but actually geopolitical currents and trying to maintain them or perhaps redirect them towards one side's interests?
No, absolutely. I think trade has always been partly economics and partly politics. And as everyone knows, that the US is trying to reorder the global supply chains because they believe that in the process of globalization that had taken place since the 1990s, and especially after China joined the WTO, and that process was driven by the United States, but that eventually it has not worked for them. Manufacturing has been sucked away from the US. China has 18% of global GDP, but 32% of global manufacturing value added. So with that kind of concentration and the kind of trade deficit US has, budget deficit US has, which it now believes is not sustainable, they want to reorder the supply chains. And I think what has happened is that while India and the US started discussions on a very substantive bilateral free trade agreement, some of the other partners of the US, as US has described it, came in with unilateral concessions to the US. US claims that Indonesia and Vietnam completely opened up their markets, and still US imposed 19% tariffs on them. They claim that Japan promised to invest $550 billion in the United States, and still US would impose 15% tariff. And they said it was the United States who will decide where the Japanese investments would be put in what sectors. And then after some time, 90% of the profit generated from that would be retained in the United States. And similarly, if you looked at the agreement they did with the EU, they said EU has committed to buy $750 billion worth of energy from the US and invest $600 billion in the US, and yet 15% tariffs on them. So he was projecting that he was getting unilateral benefits from his partners, still imposing tariffs, not giving any concessions. And by contrast, the India-US agreement that had been worked out was seen by many from the reports that came out in the public domain as a balanced agreement with gains for both sides. So I don't think they were in a position to claim unilateral concessions by India, and that may have complicated the process in July, August. So certainly there is a certain amount of economics, there's a certain amount of politics, because President Trump is trying to project to his base that he's bringing jobs and manufacturing by the US. And we have to deal with that particular political challenge.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you mentioned that he's projecting to his base, because again, this also the domestic politics aspect, which this time is the U.S. domestic politics aspect plays into here. And again, this also perhaps hints at one of the difficulties of achieving a trade deal, because one thing that's been cited there are two red lines for India. One is making sure that agriculture and manufacturing are protected. But again, this also runs as a mirror image to the American farmer and the American manufacturer, which is what the U.S. is projecting they want to protect as well. Because both sides, these two, seem to be very important to both India and the United States, will it be more difficult or near impossible to achieving a trade deal if these two red lines aren't adjusted?
So no, I'd like to nuance a bit what you said. India's approach has now changed over the years, and India has done a free trade agreement recently with the United Kingdom. Earlier, India had done a free trade agreement with the UAE, with Australia, and manufacturing is not protected in India. India has opened up that sector and has built partnerships with other countries. For example, in the automobile sector and auto component sector, India has emerged as a major exporter, and it has partners in other countries. So I think from all reports that came out, India has been forward-leaning in terms of becoming a part of the global supply chains and opening up some of these sectors. Even in agriculture, there are areas where India has imported. India imports large amount of pulses because India has deficit in pulses. And India imports large amount of oil seeds because India needs the cooking oil and for its own purposes. So agriculture per se is not protected, but there are certain areas which are very important for India because the livelihood of people in India depend on that. There are almost 700 million people in India who live off the agriculture sector, live off subsistence farming. And if their way of life is disrupted, it can lead to instability in society. So that's not a risk that you can take. And then some of the US products, for example, corn, soybean, are based on genetically modified seeds, And the GMO products is something that India has not accepted as yet, because there are many arguments out there that in a medium and longer term, they have negative consequences. So that's some of the challenges that they will try and work out. And again, from the reports that are coming out, even in agriculture, perhaps they're beginning to look at line items, at particular products that could be looked at more positively for expanding trade between the two countries, instead of a sort of broad categorization about how that sector would be approached. So I'm sure, given the broader convergence in the relationship, given the broader technology partnerships, it would be in the interest of both countries to try and work out something that works for both. And both have to be mindful of each other's sensitivities. The US has to be mindful of sensitivities in India. India is a democracy. It's 1.4 billion people. And the interests of the Indian people will have to be factored in.
Yeah. Very quickly, Ambassador Singh, Commerce Minister Piyush Goyal said that with regards to the talks with the EU, both sides should not let a perfect deal get in the way of achieving a trade agreement. Do you think this also applies to any efforts between the India and the US to achieving a trade agreement, that perhaps good enough is better than trying to strive for perfection?
No, absolutely. And one should certainly achieve whatever is doable and then build further on that. That's not the end of the world. There are subsequent years, you continue the dialogue, look for more opportunities. And as you mentioned, with the EU, the effort in India and from the EU is to try and get a free trade agreement worked out, perhaps by the end of this year, which again shows that India has become much more open to free trade agreements than it may have been some years ago.
Arun Singh, former Indian ambassador to the United States, Israel, and France, we appreciate your time and appreciate you sharing your insights on the ongoing U.S.-India trade talks. We'll be back in about 2 minutes, but don't go away. Inside India will return very shortly.
The team will be led by the Deputy Chief Secretary for Administration, with the Secretary for Innovation, Technology and Industry and the Commissioner for Digital Policy serving as the Deputy Leader and Secretary General respectively. The team will also invite a representative from the private sector to serve as another Deputy Leader to bring in new perspectives and frontline market experience. The team will examine with government departments their need for reform, with priority given to departments with greater interface with the public. Departments may also initiate requests to the team for prioritized assistance in enhancing their efficacy.
And that's Hong Kong Chief Executive John Lee there delivering his policy address. Let's get to the China Connection's Emily Tan now for more. Emily, I'm sure Mr. Chief Executive Lee said even more than just that. What else was important that we might have missed in his policy address?
He's been speaking for about 24 minutes so far, JP, and we are listening to John Lee's fourth policy address, and he has reaffirmed Hong Kong's economic growth this year projected between 2 to 3%. This would follow Q2 GDP growth of 3.1%. So we are expecting a further slowing of Hong Kong's economy, and that to do with some of the sluggishness that we're seeing over in China, not to mention the trade policies coming through from the Trump administration. Now, we are hearing from a Chief Executive John Lee, and he's talking about boosting the economy and people's livelihood. This is his pledge and the real focus of his policy address this year. Early on, he's talking about accelerating development of the northern metropolis. This is an area close to the border by the new territories with the mainland border. He's going to be setting up a committee to formulate operational models, expedite and remove barriers, and fast-track development there. This is a policy that was first announced by former Chief Executive Carrie Lam back in 2021. But as you all know and realize that during these years that we had the COVID pandemic, and of course, now he is continuing to further focus on the northern metropolis. He's looking to strengthen innovation and technology as a new engine of growth for Hong Kong, as the pillars of growth currently are fixed on finance and real estate. We also heard about accountability for heads of departments, or what he is abbreviating as HOD, enhancing the appraisal system for civil servants. Now, all of this is to do with a water contract that was granted to the Hong Kong government and was found to be allegedly fraudulent. And so with that, he has introduced now an HOD accountability system, and this is going to be establishing an effective management team where warnings, reprimanding, salary increments, as well as dismissal will be involved if there is any civil servant that is found to be at fault. Now, Chief Executive John Lee is delivering his address 1 month earlier than usual. We usually have the policy delivered in the month of October, but he says this is to accommodate the next Legislative Council, which is going to be elected in December. He has announced that this election date is on December the 7th, and we do know that this is the first meeting of this Legislative Council term. So we are continuing to watch Chief Executive John Lee delivering his policy address, and he tends to speak, in past experience, we've seen about 1.5 hours. So we'll be continuing to watch that as he delivers from the Legislative Council. JP, it's back to you.
So a lot more perhaps to expect from Chief Executive John Lee, but definitely some important snippets just there. Emily Tan from Hong Kong, thank you so much for providing us those very important updates. Meantime, the Washington Post reporting that China has allowed Wells Fargo employee Chen Yue Mao to return to the U.S. amid trade talks. Mao was barred from leaving China in July, with China's foreign ministry saying this was due to her involvement in the criminal case. There's been no comment from the U.S. lender or the U.S. State Department. We will be back in 2 minutes, but don't go away. Inside India will return. Welcome back to Inside India. Some stories on our radar this morning. A United Nations commission has released a report accusing Israel of committing genocide against Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. The report says Israeli authorities don't seem to intend to change their course of actions and urge Tel Aviv to lift the blockade on the Gaza Strip to allow the entry of humanitarian aid. Israel has rejected the report, denouncing it as, quote, distorted and false. U.S. President Donald Trump has arrived in the United Kingdom for his second state visit. Both sides are expected to announce a series of deals over the course of this trip. Ahead of that, they've already signed a technology deal to boost ties in AI and quantum computing, with U.S. firms including Microsoft and Google pledging $42 billion in UK investments. Meanwhile, United Kingdom residents are protesting Trump's visit. Images of President Trump and convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein were projected onto a tower at Windsor Castle. Alongside Trump's mugshot, photos of Epstein's victims, and Trump's alleged birthday letter to Epstein. On Tuesday, protesters also unfurled what they called the world's biggest photograph of Trump and Epstein near the castle. 4 people were arrested on suspicion of malicious communications following the stunt. And we're about 14 minutes away from the open for the Indian market session this Wednesday. And again, Nifty futures indicating another decent open when the opening bell rings. They're about 160 points above the Tuesday close. And again, they are coming off a 0.7% intraday gain in the Tuesday session. The Indian rupee was looking a little bit softer earlier on, but has now found firmer ground to stand on. 87.819 is where the rupee stands against the U.S. greenback in today's session so far. And also a new debutante in the markets later today. Shares of Urban Company will list in less than an hour, with Gray Market suggesting a strong start for the online services marketplace. Its $216 million IPO drew massive investor demand, subscribed more than 100 times overall, making it the most subscribed IPO in India so far this year. But let's go back to tariffs. And one of the hardest hit sectors by the 50% U.S. duties on Indian goods is textiles. In the last fiscal year, India exported over $5 billion worth of garments and textiles and more than $3 billion in cotton, yarn, and handloom products. Some estimates suggest the sector employs nearly 45 million people directly and over 60 million indirectly. That makes it the country's second largest employer after agriculture. But the tariffs in India are now the highest among competing nations like Bangladesh and Vietnam, making it tougher for exporters in India. Ashwin Chandran is the deputy chairman from the Confederation of Indian Textile Industry, and he's also the managing director and chairman at Precot Limited. And he joins us now to help us understand what the impact has been on the sector and what some of the players in the industry are saying about the impact, for better or worse. Ashwin, thank you so much for joining us. I assume there's been more than enough time to digest the news with regards to the tariffs, and we have seen the tariffs come online, have been in place for about a couple of weeks. I want to start off with what you're hearing from your fellow members on the ground. What exactly are some of these members saying about the tariff threat, and what has the mood been predominantly among some of your association members in the textile space?
Good morning. No, this was a rude surprise. This 50% tariff, which was announced on Indian textile and clothing exports to the US, was a rude surprise. About 30% of India's exports in textile and clothing go to the United States. And there are large capacities which are geared towards servicing the large retailers and brands in the US. So the reaction obviously has been one of surprise, one of despair, and trying to work out short-term solutions to try and mitigate this issue. I think if you look at the entire garments and home textiles sectors, there are goods which are low-value goods, goods where the customer won't be able to absorb anywhere close to this impact of the tariff. So those are the orders, those lower-value bulk volume, high-volume orders are the ones that are the most under threat. And those are the ones that are already moving to countries like Bangladesh and Vietnam. I was talking to a fellow exporter from Tirupur, which is a knitted garment export hub close to Coimbatore in Tamil Nadu. And they were telling me that for the spring-summer 2026 season, orders have already started moving out of India to other competing countries. So that is the fear, and those orders that are in the pipeline, those have already been placed and yet to be shipped out. Buyers are expecting steep discounts. So that is the situation today as far as the exports to the US are concerned.
Ashwin, correct me if I'm wrong, but over 40 million people are employed in the textile sector in India. Have you heard from your fellow members if there have been closures or job losses already related to this? And if not, is there a fear that this could actually happen at a massive clip in the next couple of months?
No, it's already happening. If you look at large capacities, there are workers who are unemployed, who are the machines don't have orders to execute. So it is happening, and I fear that this will spread if this continues. The hope is still that efforts are still on to negotiate and reduce this drastic 50% tariff down to at least a 25% level, which in some ways or means is at least manageable because the delta between us and the other competing countries comes down significantly. But you're right. The fear is that there will be large-scale closures, there will be unemployment, and the problem is once orders go away, it's not going to come back as soon as the tariffs are reversed. If you lose a season, if you lose a particular time of the year, then you're looking at 6-9 months before the order flow can start again. So that is the fear, that once you lose an order, once you lose a customer, it's not that easy to gain back that market share or gain back that customer.
You know, I hate to keep beating on this, Ashwin, but I think it's important for our viewers to understand what the impact is like in these early stages. How many job losses have we seen so far? Are they in the magnitudes of the thousands? And could this grow into the millions, perhaps? Again, just looking at a possible worst-case scenario if things happen. I don't want to be continue to be a downer for the industry, but I think it's important for us to understand what the risks are. Talk to us about what the job losses are now and how much bigger they can get.
You know, like you rightly pointed out, it's only been a couple of weeks since this 50% tariff kicked in. So it's early to speculate on what kind of numbers we could be seeing in terms of job losses. But like you rightly pointed out, textile and clothing industry is the second largest employer in the country. Around 4 crore people or 40 million people is the total employment. And if you look at even 10% of that, it's a very significant number. And that is the kind of risk that we have. Because if you look at the overall size of our textile and clothing industry, about 10% of the entire output goes to the US. So that's something that we stand to lose if this continues for much longer.
Ashwin, I spoke to the folks at the Seafood Export Association of India about the impact, and they're also feeling the same heat that the textilers are as well. And I did ask him about the scenarios. If the tariffs can be brought down to 25%, he said it will hurt, but we can deal with that. 50% might not be something we can actually deal with. What is the reality for the textilers? Can you survive if they bring it down to 25%? Or is that still going to be a hill? Is that still going to be something that's going to be too hard to surmount for you guys?
I think 50% is definitely too hard to surmount. But if you look at the relative, if you look at the comparison with our competing countries, I think you put up a graphic earlier which showed that a lot of the competing countries of ours, such as Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Vietnam, they're all at around 20%. So if our tariff comes down, India's tariff comes down to 25%, that 5% delta is manageable. But obviously, when you talk about a 30% delta where we are now, that is definitely too hard to surmount and not surmountable in most cases. So as my fellow exporters in the seafood industry mentioned, a 25% tariff would hurt. There would be pain, but at least the threat of losing business would be largely mitigated.
Ashwin, here's the thing, though. You might say that the Vietnams and the Bangladeshis and Sri Lankas of the world have much lower tariffs than India, but there's also scale. You can only compete if you have the capacity to do that. And because of how big India is as compared to these other countries, is it possible to say that, India still has the scale to provide textiles at this clip as compared to these other countries? Or are your competitors at a scale where they can actually take away significant market share now, even though the delta of sizes between India and, say, Vietnam Vietnam or Sri Lanka, which is only 35 million people, if I'm not mistaken, is quite significant. Is there enough for Sri Lanka to be a threat now to take away that market share from India? Just an example.
I think, the Indian textile and clothing industry is definitely large, but it's also very fragmented. We do have a lot of small and medium-sized businesses. So as compared to, say, Bangladesh, Bangladesh's garment exports are in fact larger than India's garment exports. And Bangladesh has larger companies as well, companies with the ability to handle orders in the millions of pieces, to handle orders for buyers like Walmart, Uniqlo, who place orders in bulk, very high volumes. So I think that threat is, like I was mentioning earlier, the high volume items, the lower value items, where you need scale. I think those are the orders that are threatening to be moved away quite fast because they're very, very price sensitive. So while India does have a large textile and clothing industry, the threat that's posed by Bangladesh and Vietnam is very, very real. And we are already seeing business moving to those countries.
All right. Ashwin, the talks between the United States and India have restarted somewhat, as you've must have noted out there. And, this round, we're not, according to Rajesh Argawal, one of the chief negotiators, he said, this recent round were not negotiations per se, but a way to find out how they can restart talks. I do ask, because these aren't negotiations, but negotiations to have negotiations. Do you think that more can be done to speed up talks? And is that going to be crucial, actually, for the Indian government to speed up these talks to get to a deal? How important is that?
No, it is very important. From the industry side, we've been urging the government. We had a meeting with the Honorable Minister for Finance, Mrs. Nirmala Sitharaman, in Chennai a couple of weeks ago. And we had urged the government to try and speed up the negotiations. But I think it's easier said than done because it involves a whole host of industries, a whole host of products, especially agriculture and dairy products are something I think that are sensitive in nature. So there's been a lot of talk about how that is to be resolved. But we do hope that the government also, we laid down to the Honorable Minister of Finance that, they could provide us measures in terms of to mitigate losses that we're seeing. Because obviously you have loans with the banks, you have repayments to be made, and those can't happen if your business is not running at full steam. We also have workers to support. Today, the fear is if the worker leaves the company, it's very difficult to get them back. So companies are today supporting, paying a percentage, even to workers who are they're not able to employ. So we were requesting the government for help in those areas. If we could, like how we were extended certain relief measures during COVID, if we could look at relief measures to help support the industry in this difficult time. But the biggest support would be getting the tariff down. There's nothing that the government can do that will elevate the pain as much as lowering the tariff to 25% at least.
Okay. Now, Ashwin, maybe somewhat, I am curious in conjunction to that, with regards to a relief package that they said they extended to export sectors like the textile industry that were hit by tariffs. Have your members seen this relief package already? And do you think it's been enough to at least help you shelter or find shelter amidst this tariff storm and uncertainty?
No, we haven't seen anything yet. The government has spoken to us. They've asked us in what ways and means they could help. We have proposed a series of measures, like I mentioned, something akin to what was done during COVID in terms of financial help and in terms of possibly we already have certain export incentives and duty drawback scheme. So we've asked whether those numbers could be increased, in the short term, whether that support could come in from the government. But we're yet to hear anything, any firm plan being laid out. We have been assured that it's forthcoming, but we're yet to hear from them.
Yeah, so basically, just to clarify, Ashwin, you have not received or seen a relief package yet extended to the textile industry, as has been reported to, as the government is preparing at the moment.
Exactly. The government is preparing one, but it's yet to be laid out.
All right. Ashwin, I do want to ask also about one of the solutions that everyone talks about amidst all of these tariff negotiations, and it doesn't just apply to India, but other countries as well. Let's just pivot to other markets. Let's look at the EU. Let's look at Africa. Let's look at some of the other areas like Southeast Asia, for instance. How easy or difficult is it going to be for the textile industry to pivot to other markets? And will this be enough to make up for the shortfall from the tariff losses expected from the United States?
Market diversification has been a focus of the textile and clothing industry, but it's not an easy task. It's not easy to acquire a customer in a new market. It requires time and effort. So it's not something that can be done for the short term. It's not going to alleviate the short-term pain that we're facing. But definitely going forward, I think this has been a lesson for a lot of companies who are very reliant on the US market, that they do need to diversify the geographies that they sell to, and our free trade agreements that we are negotiating. We've already agreed on a free trade agreement with the UK. One is in the works with the EU. So those will definitely help. If the free trade agreement with the EU can be concluded earlier rather than later, then that would definitely help companies mitigate some of this pain that we're feeling from the tariffs from the US.
Yeah, and Ashwin, again, I hate to ask this question because it almost seems like I'm wishing ill will on the textile industry. But how soon do you think might we see even more grave effects on the textile industry? Because at the moment you're saying that we're seeing some job losses, we're seeing some exporters saying that they're starting to idle their mills. How much more time before we see even worse second round effects should a deal not be achieved to try and calm the tariff storm?
I think anything more than a quarter, anything more than 3 months from now would be a disaster for companies who have exposure to the US. Because there's only so much that you can lay off your workers or put off your production. At some point, it's going to start having an impact on the company's finances. So that's not something that's easy to sustain. And a lot of textile companies are geared towards running at very high capacity utilization levels. So if a company is, say, even running 20 or 30% below what it should be running in terms of capacity utilization, it could be quite damaging for the balance sheet and its ability to keep afloat. So I'd say anything more than a quarter or 3 months from now, if we don't see de-escalation or at least a lowering to that 25% level, that could have serious and long-term impacts on the industry.
Right. Yeah, but Ashwin, very quickly, what about the other side? If these free trade agreements with the EU or whatever, or the likes, if they are inked, let's say, by the end of the year, how soon before the effects, the positive effects of those, if there are any, show up? How soon might we see that alleviate things? Let's just say if they're achieved by December of this year.
It would take, in my view, the season itself is about 6 to 8 months, depending on the product. A retailer or a brand would place an order at least 6 to 8 months in advance of when the goods need to get onto the shelves. So that's the minimum time period required to acquire an order. And like I mentioned earlier, acquiring a customer could take a little longer. So I would say 9 to 12 months is the period that is required before any significant spurt in business happens to a country where an FTA is concluded. So if you, like you said, December, then you're looking at almost the end of the 2026 by the time fresh business starts to flow.
All right, a lot of things that are on the line for the very important textile industry in India, and the impact seems to be getting worse from the tariff uncertainty at the moment. Ashwin Chandran from the Confederation of Indian Textile Industry and Precot Limited, that is. We thank you for your time, and we wish nothing but the best for the Indian textile industry as they try to weather this dark storm. Indian markets have joined the trading day, but we will look at some movers in Mumbai after a short break. Don't go away. We'll be back in about 2 minutes. couple of minutes into the start of the Wednesday midweek session out in India, and we're seeing the Nifty 50 doing exactly what those GIFT Nifty futures were foreshadowing, and now above 25,300 in the opening minutes. The Indian rupee also looking to be a bit steadier and on firmer ground. 87.84 is where the local currency currently sits against the greenback, hours before the much anticipated Federal Reserve decision later on Wednesday afternoon U.S. time. India's Jindal Group making a non-binding bid for Germany's largest steelmaker, ThyssenKrupp's steel unit. The deal could mark a major expansion of the group's global footprint. Jindal Steel International says it will secure production, finish a green steel plant in Duisburg, and invest over 2 billion euros in new capacity. The company also pledged to take on ThyssenKrupp's pension liabilities, a key hurdle in previous failed deals. Shares of Jindal Steel in the red today, just trimming a touchdown to 1,051 rupees. ThyssenKrupp shares, though, closed up by 4.4% out in Germany just the other night. Let's look at some of the movers in the Indian markets today. And so far, we are seeing Apollo Tyres so far up by about 1.1%, and that's because the Indian cricket team has a new sponsor. The cricket board has named Apollo Tyres as the new lead sponsor of the national team, replacing Dream 11. The fantasy sports platform had to exit its $44 million deal after a ban on real money gaming, that is, last month. The new contract runs until March of 2028, and Apollo's logo will feature on the jerseys of India's men's and women's teams across all formats. The tire maker called it an honor, citing cricket's unmatched popularity at home and worldwide. And moving to the hospitality space, let's get out to CNBC's travel editor, Monica Petrelli. And Monica, you spoke to a very special guest this morning. I'll let you lay out who it was and why it was so fascinating. Tell us more about who you had a conversation with.
Good morning, JP. So this morning, I had the pleasure of sitting down with Alan Watts. He's Hilton's APAC president, and we talked about an announcement coming from the company earlier this week that Hilton now operating 160 luxury and lifestyle hotels in Asia Pacific, a number which it says will quickly rise to 250 in the next coming years. Now, we spoke about a new brand making its Asia debut right here in Hong Kong, opening last month. It's called Motto. By the company's own admission, very small rooms. They're said to be cleverly compact, about the size of a parking space. But with many lifestyle hotels, that's what we're seeing. The emphasis not on the rooms, much more on the social space, creating that sense of community for travelers, which many say they want these days. Now, these hotels also popular with investors because they're usually smaller, easier to convert, quicker to build, and thus faster to bring to market. Now, investment in Asia Pacific in terms of hotels down, moderating this year, about 23% for the first half of this year compared to last year. 84% of that really concentrated in 5 markets, led by Japan, then China, Australia, Singapore, and South Korea. But I did get a chance to speak to Alan about India, both in terms of demand and investment. Here's what he had to say.
The investment in India is at an all-time high. I've been in the market for a long time. I've never seen so much international demand or domestic demand for India, and that's about one thing. And it's not travel demand, it's infrastructure build. We are at the end of a travel experience, and so if you think of 10,000 kilometers of road or 50,000 kilometers of rail getting laid in India, or if you think of the privatization of the airports, another 70 airports moving into the private sphere, you are seeing people look at China, the population base, and do some bad math. But that math is 986 domestic market in China, and that's in the billions. And then you look at India, it's only 186 billion today. As that infrastructure build comes in, there are a lot of people diving into the India hospitality space with good reason.
The hotel investments in Asia Pacific are expected to bounce back, and in the year up about 5% according to JLL's projections. Much of that on the back of strong travel demand that we are seeing continue to drive up prices, about 15% in Japan and 10% over in India. It's back to you, JP.
Yeah, and as if India didn't need more hot sectors to watch out, it seems tourism was something that we'll have to keep on our radars as well. Monica Petrelli, thank you so much for bringing that to us with regards to your conversation with Hilton Asia Pacific. Well, that's all the time we have today on Inside India, but do keep watching CNBC. Access Middle East is up next. Have a good morning.